Hello and welcome to this Ocean Justice webinar, Why Equity, Diversity and Inclusion Matters in the Ocean Sector. This is the first in a series of webinars that the Ocean and Coastal Futures team will be hosting every few months over the next 2 years. The Ocean Justice series is kindly supported by the Esme Fairbairn Foundation. My name is David Tudor. I'm a Director of Ocean and Coastal Futures and I'll be your host for today. So Ocean and Coastal Futures is a convener of change in the ocean sector, and through this Ocean Justice series, we want to create space to discuss, debate and learn about aspects of equity, diversity and inclusion across the sector. These sessions are as much about learning as anything else. But why are we here today and why is this series important? Well, we believe creating a space such as these webinars is a crucial part of fostering change. We believe we won't solve the problems we're trying to solve in the sector if we all share the same blind spot, and we welcome different viewpoints into this space. We won't move things forward if we don't really listen to people who don't share our own views. Today, we welcome your challenging questions, so long as they're constructive and respectful. So, on to today's webinar. On this webinar, we'll be focusing on 2 key questions. Why we need a more diverse and inclusive marine and coastal sector. And secondly, why we need to transfer more power to young people and communities in marine decision making. We have an amazing panel of ocean advocates who are very grateful for giving their time today. We have Yvette Curtis, EDI Manager at Surfacing and Sewage and founder of Wahines. Alan Munro, Founder and Director of Young Sea Changers Scotland. We also have Ffion Mitchell-Langford. Ffion wears many hats, but here today as project designer and manager of the Marine Conservation Society's Hiraeth and More project. We also have Caitlin Turner. Caitlin is a trustee of Young Sea Changers Scotland and currently carrying out a Master's in Marine Vertebrate Ecology and Conservation at Exeter University. And we also have Celine Gamond-Duret, a lecturer at Lancaster University and principal investigator on 2 projects, Seasides and Ocean Justice and the Blue Economy. So I'm just going to give you some general housekeeping for those of you watching here today. As you will see, you're all muted with your cameras off. There is a chat function. So this chat function can be used to introduce yourselves, if you'd like, to make comments or to share resources. Also, there'll be 3 polls throughout this next hour and a half, and they'll all be anonymous. But importantly, there's a Q&A function. So right at the top of your screen, if you expand your screen and maximize it, you should see a Q&A button. Please use this to post any questions you have to the panel. This Q&A function is completely anonymous. And like I said earlier, while we ask that the questions are constructive and respectful, we do welcome the challenging questions. If you like some question that someone's posed, please upvote it. You can do that. But also just to note, there's some versions of Teams you may have don't allow the Q&A function. So if you do have a question and you can't use the Q&A function, please just put it into the chat. So as I said, we're going to have some polls here today to get some feedback from the audience. So just before we meet our panel, we want to carry out a very quick poll just to see who we have from the sector in the room today. So we'll just launch this poll now and hopefully you'll be able to interact and answer those questions. So I'll give you a minute or 2 just to answer that, and the results will be in the chat in a moment. So we'll move on. We're now time to get our speakers, our panelists onto the screen. Welcome all of you. It's lovely to see you on the screen. Thank you. So we'll start off just to introduce yourselves. Tell us a little bit about your work. Tell us a little bit about yourselves. And also tell us your definition of ocean justice and what it means to you. And I'll just go round the room. So I'll start with you, Celine.
Thank you very much, David. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm a lecturer in environmental politics and policy at Lancaster University. And my research looks at sustainability and sustainable development and what it means for the marine environment. And in particular, I am interested in the social and cultural component of sustainable development, hence the question of justice. And I'm leading two projects that are of interest to today's discussion. First, the Seaside Project. This is a British Academy-funded project in which I've investigated the views of young people in the Northwest about the coastal and marine environment. How do they feel about the coast and the sea? What are their aspirations? And I did it through the use of photography. And so the project was very much about young people's view of the sea as it was about the methodology, photography, and how to use creative tools to engage with young people. The other project is a living room funded project called Ocean Justice and the Blue Economy. And it is made of two elements. First, we are doing a large corpus linguistic analysis of the academic literature, policy documents, and legal documents to see to which extent documents on the blue economy talk about justice. And the other element is a fieldwork to understand what ocean justice means for coastal communities in different cultural contexts across the world, what it means for them, what is their sense of justice and injustice. So to answer your question, what is my definition of ocean justice? So very basically, I would say for me, it is about applying the principle of environmental justice to the coastal and marine environment. In other words, applying the principle of distributive justice, procedural justice, recognition justice, which is a common understanding of environmental justice. So for me, ocean justice is very much about, it refers to who is affected by coastal and ocean development, but also who is being valued, who is included, and who has an influence in decisions being made.
Wonderful, thanks, Celine. It's great to have an academic and a researcher and somebody talking about the blue economy. Thank you. Caitlin, over to you.
Hi, thank you for having me along. My name is Caitlin Turner, my pronouns are she, her, and currently I am a master's student studying Marine Vertebrate Ecology and Conservation with the University of Exeter. But alongside this, I am a trustee for Young Sea Changers Scotland, and I'm also a bit of an independent ocean advocate and marine conservationist as well. I do have a background in fisheries management, having firstly worked for Seafish as a fisheries project officer. And basically I was involved in, fresh out of university as well, I was involved in helping to develop the fisheries management plans for crab, lobster and whelk in English waters. And then I moved on to be a policy officer for the Sustainable Inshore Fisheries Trust in Scotland, which is a teeny tiny little organisation. Quite literally there were 3.5 of us with the organisation, and we focus on Scottish inshore waters and their conservation and ensuring that coastal community voices were being heard in legislation and advocacy as well. And I've just always been interested in the ocean since a very young age. I wanted to be a mermaid when I was a kid, and that didn't quite work out, so I went with the next best thing. But I was from a landlocked place, and I was also a young carer for a disabled mum, so I've faced quite a few barriers in my life accessing the spaces that I've been able to get into. But even in saying that, I'm aware that I'm still a young white woman, and therefore I still have privilege within myself, despite personal adversities I've faced to get into this sector and in these spaces. And I want to utilise some of my own personal experience to help other young people who might face the same sort of challenges and journeys to realise that whatever it is that they want to do in life, wherever it is that they want to go, that they can get there. It might sometimes take a little more of a bumpier ride than others, but you can get there if it's where you want to be. And we can all be ocean advocates and environmentalists regardless of our upbringing or where we come from. And I guess, again, to answer the question, what ocean justice means to me it means it's intersectional, that we recognise how that has to be a core driver of all the work that we undertake and the advocacy that we undertake, whatever sector it is that we are part of, marine or environmental, that it includes Indigenous knowledge and teachings within it as well, because really these Indigenous groups are the ones that know how to live in harmony with the environment, but also meet their own needs. And also recognising that some groups are disproportionately affected by environmental crises than others, and to take an approach that we're not just marching in there, especially as white Westerners, and saying this is how things should be done, but learning alongside local communities in the best way that we can help to serve them and in the environment that surrounds them as well. So yeah, intersectionality, I think, is key to ocean justice for me.
Great, thanks, Caitlin. It's really interesting. And don't give up yet on the mermaid thing. So keep going, as you said, bumpy road and all that. So I'll keep on moving. Over to you, Yvette.
Thanks, David. Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks for having me today. So my name's Yvette Curtis. My pronouns are she, her. I come to you as the Equity, Diversity and Inclusion Manager for Surfers Against Sewage. And as David said, the founder of Wahines, which is a surf club for women and girls, particularly those from marginalised community groups. And I came to this particular sector completely by accident. It wasn't something that I set out to do as a young person at all. Entered through sports, so came through surfing, which led me to spend quite a lot of time within the ocean, which then led me to see how we abuse the ocean and the coastline that the ocean is on. So then became quite sort of outspoken in how we need to protect those spaces and those areas, but also really very, very aware that there weren't many people who looked like me within surfing and surfing structures, and that then translated across through into ocean advocacy, activism and conservation. It's a very homogenous sort of sector through both of those avenues. So began sort of talking into that quite a lot more, and actually learning sort of what were those barriers for myself, and what must be those barriers for other communities. Again, that intersectional nature within diversity was a real driver for me. So I've kind of come just through lifestyle and through growing up in a city to then relocating to live by the coast. So very much have an urban background and setting to my youth. So for me, it's been a really, really different but very much an organic journey of development to bring me to this space. In answer to the ocean justice question, I view ocean justice very much as something that we're all affected by. I don't think it's, it's sort of bespoke just for those who live by the coastlines or those who are on sort of small independent developing states either. I think it's every single person on the planet needs to be involved in the ocean, because it is what sustains us. It is what we're breathing in. So we all need to have a say in how we protect it, how we access it, and we'll all have different connections to it, whether we know them or not. So I think I come from very much the line of talking to people about what their connection is to water, how they engage with it, where they are, is that ancestral or is it physical for them, and what are those connections, negative or positive, and how they can foster those connections into making sort of equitable and positive change within the global ocean that we have. So yeah, hope that answered your question.
That does. Thank you, Yvette. It's really interesting. It's really good to get that kind of diversity of kind of, I guess, upbringing, isn't it? But, you come from the urban setting and ended up by the coast, and that's just as valid as anybody else who was born by the sea. Moving to you, Alan.
Great. Thanks, David. And thanks for having me along. Apologies in advance. I've got a bit of a head cold today, unfortunately, so I'll be a bit croaky, so I'll do my best to stay coherent. So yeah, I'm Alan. I'm the founder and director of a small marine charity called Young Sea Changers Scotland, and formerly, until very recently actually, I was also the coordinator of a network called the Coastal Communities Network, working for an organisation called Fauna and Flora based here in Edinburgh. I should say I'm originally from a small remote coastal community actually in Scotland called Wick, if anyone has heard of it, up in the northeast. So yeah, I founded and now direct Young Sea Changers Scotland. We're a team of 3 people, so we are also very tiny, but with an amazing board of trustees, and I'm glad to see Caitlin here today. And I guess I'll just say a little bit about what YSCS was set up for. I mean, in its sort of simplest terms, it was really to give young people 16 to 25 in Scotland a voice on all matters related to the sea, just recognising that traditionally young people are excluded for various reasons that we'll discuss later today from these spaces. So YSCS really is a platform that provides young people with opportunities and support to be able to have their voices heard on all the issues that they care about. So just to sort of say a few ways that we do this. So we work directly with a growing community of young people and support them with skills and confidence building and training and resources to be able to access marine policy spaces confidently. We also want to sort of look at engagement processes and structures within the sector and how we can make those more inclusive to youth voices as well. So there's sort of an advocacy element to our work. And finally, building a movement, basically, connecting young people to one another, helping them learn from one another, and realizing that they're not alone in their endeavors, and that there is a whole community of young people out there who are really passionate about marine ocean justice issues. And just to answer that question around ocean justice, I'm going to give just a rather, I guess, simplistic definition, but I completely agree with everything that's been sort of said beforehand, and not to reiterate that, but for me, I think ocean justice is it's very basic level, ensuring that everyone, regardless of what your background or circumstances are, can benefit from ocean resources and are empowered and supported to be able to contribute to having a say to its management, to its conservation, to its protection. So those are my views on that.
Thank you, Alan. It's really good. And by the way, your voice sounds absolutely fine, so don't worry about that. It's great. And finally, on for this part, Ffion.
Pnawn pawb, great i bod yma. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. It's really lovely to be here. My name's Ffion Mitchell-Langford. My pronouns are she, her. As Dave mentioned, I wear quite a lot of hats. Today, predominantly, I'll be wearing the Hiraeth and Amor project legacy lead hat, which is a project hosted by the Marine Conservation Society that's being run with and alongside underserved coastal communities here in North East Wales. So our project is all about growing ocean literacy as a way to kind of equitably support sustainable management of our local MPA, our marine protected area. So that's a big focus. And another hat that I'm wearing today and we'll dip into. So I have a role with Campaign for National Parks, which is an amazing and also small but mighty NGO that operates across the UK as the National Marine Parks lead. So it's really, really lovely to be with you all today. I think my definition of ocean justice, and I guess lots of overlapping aspects of that definition with everything that everyone has already shared so far. But I think to add to that, for me, it's not just about kind of fair and equitable access to the benefits of the ocean, but also the understanding that we all equally have a role to play in carrying the burden of what it means to protect it and look after it, and that recognition that we are all stewards of our natural environment, including the ocean. Diolch, Dave.
Thank you, Ffion. That's great. Thank you all for your kind of snappy introductions. It's really great to kind of ground where we are today and get that definition out there, and for the audience to know where you're from. And just to say, just a reminder to everybody out there, please put your questions in the Q&A as we go along, and I'll kind of keep an eye on it as we go along as well. So I'm going to ask all of you now around, why do we need a more diverse and inclusive ocean sector? Now that might seem like a obvious question, or may follow on nicely from what you said before, but you've talked about where you work for. You work for NGOs, or you work for universities, or you work in the leisure sector, or have done in the past. We all know, especially if you're from the UK or work in the UK, that it's not a very diverse sector, whether it's ethnicity or any other underrepresented group. You only have to look around essentially for the obvious visible traits anyway. And some people might say, well, it doesn't matter, does it? As long as you get the best people, that's all really good, isn't it? But just very briefly, if I can just ask each of you just to say, why do we need a more diverse and inclusive marine and coastal sector? And I'll start with you, Caitlin, if that's okay.
Yeah, I think, touching back on what I'd said before is, and obviously as others have mentioned, this is an issue. Any issues that affect the ocean affect all of us, but some groups will be disproportionately affected compared to others, whether that's in personal circumstance or whether that is as a community, that they'll be disproportionately affected by the climate and biodiversity crises. And I think if those voices are not included in any form of advocacy or work, that NGOs or anyone else that's responsible for raising awareness of the effects of any issues affecting the ocean, or advocacy at a political level, if those voices aren't included, then the problems affecting them are only going to worsen over time. And at the end of the day, we'll are intrinsically connected not only to the environment but in different ways to each other. And if one group starts to fall because these issues are compounding upon them, then it affects the rest of us in a different way, and eventually along the timeline. It might not hit us right now, but obviously it will come eventually, and we need to ensure that these voices are included. I know that disabled people, and especially groups that are Black and Asian minorities and things, they're all disproportionately affected in different areas as well across the world by environmental and ocean issues. And unless we can uplift them and include them in decision making and policy making to ensure that their needs are met and that the problems are addressed with them in mind, then yeah, if one group falls, then the rest of us will ultimately fall as well. So we need to ensure that our decision making is inclusive and that diverse voices are included to ensure nobody's left behind.
That's okay. And you know, be interesting to know from you as well. You know, you've just started your master's degree in Exeter, and you've obviously done an undergraduate degree in a similar topic, I assume. You know, there's a much quoted stat these days that the marine science is the least diverse degree in the UK. You know, so there's got to be reasons for that, hasn't there? Really, I mean, I don't know what the mix is like on your course at the moment, or if you've got any ideas of why that is, or any kind of guesses, I suppose.
I think in my undergraduate, I was in a unique situation in Scotland that your tuition is free for Scottish students. So that certainly helped to break down a lot of the barriers to access for young people getting into the degree. And actually, our degree in marine biology at the University of Stirling was most of the class were all young women, which was actually great to see, because I'd heard a lot as well from webinars like this that women in the sector were basically like on their own pretty much, or they were facing quite a lack of diversity and other women being in it. So to see a class so full of young people was wonderful, but you did also recognise that it was a lot of young white Scottish students for most part. And then in a sort of different sway down here in Exeter, I really struggled to even decide whether I was going to do the masters, because then you have to fork out quite a lot of money. It's close to 16 grand for a year for the masters, which for someone coming from a low income background, I'm still figuring out how I'm affording this. But it is really hard, and that's a massive barrier for young people to access further education in marine sciences and also in the sector for jobs as well, because quite a lot of the jobs require very specialised skill sets that you might only be able to get through either paying an external course or doing it as part of either your undergrad or your masters. So I think the financial barrier is a massive one. Fortunately, I've seen, at least at Exeter, that there's quite a lot of programmes and scholarships that are offered to try and encourage people from underrepresented groups to come to Exeter. So I think there's a Chevening scholarship or something like that, which is basically dedicated to people from developing countries to be able to come over to the University of Exeter and study whatever subject it is. Quite a bit of that is environmental, but it's providing the sort of funding and resources to communities that they recognise as being underrepresented to try and offer that sort of bridge to get there. But of course, they're really highly competitive for people to get into as well. But it's a step in this right direction. It would be great if they just reduced tuition full stop. But that's obviously in an ideal world. But I do think the financial aspect is a massive barrier to it. And without that free education I had in Scotland, I don't think I would have ever had undergrad education.
Okay, that's really interesting. And I'll come to you, Celine, next, actually, because I'm happy for you to talk about university, but also be interested in your perspective on the work you've done overseas as well, not just in the UK, on that question about why do we need a more diverse sector? Yeah,
for me, this is just an ethical requirement. It's the simple fact we're asking the question means that something needs to be done, but it should not be a question anymore, because it's just evident, and that should be at the core, as Caitlin said before, that should be at the core of any decision we're making at the moment. I would also say that non-inclusion is simply not sustainable. If we just basically look at that, what sustainable means, it's not just about the balance between the environment and the economy. It's about the social, cultural component. It's about people. And we tend to forget about that when we talk about sustainability, but people are central, and all people in the diversity. And I would also say that when we are looking at what is happening in the coastal and marine world, it's interesting to reflect on what has happened before that on land and to draw lessons from that. So if we look, for example, at conservation efforts on land, the creation of protected areas, the conflict with indigenous people, for example, have been very, very much covered and discussed. And we know that there have been a lot of damage and harm being done to indigenous groups, vulnerable populations, because of conservation projects, because they've not been included. That should not be the case. And also it means that very often these projects are not even efficient. They don't even work as well because they lack something. So there's also an element of efficiency when we're talking about inclusivity. So looking at future development in the oceans and the future creation of protected areas, marine protected areas, for example, we really need to take into account local coastal communities, and because it's also about their own very sense of place and identity and connection that can be very, very strong with the ocean. And I very much prefer framing things in terms of ethics, but the efficiency argument is there. And the more diverse, the more inclusive we are, the more critical thinking we have, the more we can think about a problem from different angles, the more diverse type of solution and innovation we can have. So there's also an element of efficiency there, but for me it's really just an ethical requirement that should not be questioned anymore.
Thanks, Lena. That's really interesting. I don't know if you call it the two ends of the spectrum, the ethics and the efficiency is very much a kind of an innate sense versus something that's kind of just very obvious, well, it's more efficient, so why not do it? So there's multiple reasons, I guess, is what we're talking about. And I come to you next, Alan, because obviously, building on the young people you work with now, but also your previous role around the kind of coastal community network and all of that. Have you seen or got examples of why being more inclusive is better, is helpful, better decisions, or why we need it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So if I, think about, one of the reasons I absolutely love working with young people in this sector is because they're not entrenched in the status quo. They come to these spaces with new ideas, out of the box thinking. And if we reflect on the fact that the sort of challenges facing our seas right now are very multifaceted and complex, it's that sort of way of thinking and outside of the box, bringing all these new solutions that we critically need. And also say with young people particularly, I think it goes without saying, but I'll repeat it anyway. The sort of state of our seas are in, the seas are in pretty dire strait, right? And it's the young people today who are going to have to live with the consequences and be the ones responsible for developing and implementing the solutions in the future. So it's sort of, for me, it's a fundamental right for young people specifically to be involved in the sort of conversations around how we protect and manage our seas right now. And that's and the same sort of applies to the sort of coastal communities. Added to that, and it's sort of been reflected already by Caitlin and Celine, but it is an issue of sort of social justice. Historically, coastal communities particularly have been marginalized from decision making and have been at the forefront of bad policy making, where it has been imposed from the top down, and we've seen examples of where that just doesn't work anymore. So these groups, these communities, they have deep cultural and economic ties to the sea, and it's to all of our benefit, policymakers in particular, that we harness that knowledge and that connection and come up with solutions that work for everybody. Because the opposite, it just won't work. And the highly protected marine areas consultation last year was a really good example of what happens if you try and impose solutions from the outside without actually listening to what coastal communities need.
Right, thanks, Alan. I move to you, Yvette. You're a professional in this area. Your job is around EDI for surfacing and sewage. And I suppose to flip the question slightly for you, really, about why do we need a more diverse marine coastal sector is, have you come across people or organisations, either overtly or covertly, saying that, well, it makes no difference? Why bother? Does it really make any difference?
Probably covertly, I would say. People don't want to admit that, they don't want to engage with people for whatever reason. But I think, it is just going to perpetuate the issues and the problems that we're experiencing now. I think especially globally, especially as what your feelings are on sort of Commonwealth and overseas territories are. I have my own personal views. I'm sure you can imagine I'm probably not for them. So basically, when you're then looking at, for example, British overseas territories, you know, the majority of our largest marine protected areas are not based around our sort of UK territorial waters. They are based overseas. So those are the areas that we are seemingly trying to protect more. But my concerns are, how are we protecting those areas? Are those, you know, is this just coming from sort of UK central government, which, you know, my understanding of the subject, it actually is coming from UK central government with limited input from those island nations. And at that point, you're really not getting the crux of the issues and what the communities need, what their drivers are, what their barriers are, what, you know, you're going to potentially stop them from fishing in their own waters. You're going to potentially stop them from tourism income, you know, by imposing what you view as the issues based on research and stuff that you have created, which may or may not be skewed to the outcome that you want to achieve. So I, you know, for my thinking is having communities that are based within those island nations and likewise across the UK mainland, having communities. I'm just going to turn my camera back on and off because I've just gone purple. There we go, back to normal. It happens weirdly a lot. So, you know, I think the reality is we're only speaking to certain communities because we want a certain outcome. And actually, the minute we're looking at different diverse experiences, we're going to get, exactly as Celine said, we're going to get that critical thinking. We're going to get other people's perspectives, which are hugely, hugely important in these areas. For example, you know, I've got sort of Mauritian and Bangladeshi heritage within me. So I'm very much, you know, aware of the MPAs that were put around, you know, the British Indian Ocean overseas territories that then had to be removed because they bisected the Mauritian government imposed marine protected areas. And obviously now, you know, those islands have actually gone and been returned. But those are things that are always in the back of my mind because I notice them when they're in the news. I notice, you know, the Bangladeshi coastline being encroached because of climate change. It's right at the forefront. So I think those connections, those global connections, shouldn't be underestimated when we're looking at first and second generation sort of immigrants and mixed heritage families like myself, because I will have a different global view as to what's happening to someone who is sort of, you know, is born and raised within, you know, the British Islands, but also someone who is currently living in those sort of territorial waters and those islands there. So I think we need to be looking at a much bigger audience of people before we take these really, really critical decisions that are affecting so many. Hope that didn't ramble too much there.
No, it's really good about it. It's really interesting, and you know, bringing in the UK overseas territories is a really interesting point, isn't it? Because there's a, you know, in some ways it vastly increases the UK's sea space, but is that process, I guess, is what you're questioning, is different? Is it different to the domestic, I guess, isn't it? And if it does, well, should it? Well, probably shouldn't be, should it? I'll come to you, Ffion, as well, and just asking the same question about, you know, why do we need a more diverse sector? But also there's a question that's come through in the Q&A around actually the work you do around national marine parks in the UK. And I don't want to dwell too much on that because that's a different topic altogether, really. But I suppose the question is really relevant because it says around, you know, do you think that concept would help make the marine and coastal space more accessible and inclusive? So I guess my question to you is, you know, again, is there, do we need to make it more diverse? And do you think there's a barrier to making the coast or marine or MPAs inaccessible?
Yeah, great question. Thanks for whoever shared that question in the Q&A. So just to touch on the first question first then around why do we need diversity and inclusion in our ocean sector? So I think even if we were to just pause that conversation for a minute, right, around diversity and inclusion, and we were just to look at how are we actually doing as an ocean sector in terms of what it is that we're striving to achieve. And obviously, in the face of the climate and nature crisis, we all know, I'm sure, in this room today, we're not making the progress at the rate that we need to be making in order to actually tackle those things effectively. Therefore, perhaps the natural conclusion is we're not doing something quite right. We need to change how we're doing something, or we're not doing enough of something, right? So really kind of where we're at, I think, points as a pretty clear indicator for the need of diversification for a lot of reasons that people have already covered. You know, we need diversification to improve efficiency, productivity, you know, decision making, problem solving. I mean, for me personally, diversification is the home of innovation. You know, that's where innovation sits. You know, it's really interesting, Alan, you talking about the status quo earlier, because this is the problem, right? We're all kind of being held back very much so by this societally ingrained kind of status quo. And what that means is we're really not allowing ourselves actually to fulfill our potential and to really prioritize what is important, which is involving everybody. You know, we need diversification to grow, like from a business sense or from an organizational sense or just from an environmental sense. You know, diversification is how we're going to improve like resilience, our own personal capacity, organizational capacity, and that's what it means to safeguard our future. Again, picking up on what Celine was talking about around kind of sustainability and being sustainable. Being sustainable means involving everybody, right? Because as individuals, as organizations, no matter if we are public, private, or third sector, we can't be everywhere all of the time, all at once. But do you know who is? The communities that live in those spaces. They are there all the time. So we need to pay better due regard to that and involve them and share our power more accordingly. So for me, that is why we need a diverse and inclusive sector. Just to pick up on the question around national marine parks. So our MPA network around the UK is, you know, it's a really complex one. It's really overlapping, and it's very, very, very hard for the normal average Joe. So I'm assuming that might not be any of us in the room, right? Because maybe everyone here is involved in some way with the ocean and marine sector already. But if we're just thinking about those people that are not inside this room, how can they engage with our MPA network? What are the opportunities for them to do that? So for me, thinking about innovation and diversification of our MPA network, or at least how we perceive and can engage with that, we being everyone in the UK, it's really thinking about what can we do differently in that space. So the beauty of the National Marine Park model is that it's not really something that's happening in the UK, right? We have incredible examples globally from all over the world where national marine parks are a very effective and successful model at better connecting people to their local coast and sea and marine space. But we don't have those in the UK, bar of course this amazing self-designation down in Plymouth Sound. So for me, that's one of my roles that I'm going to take a lot of excitement in exploring and investigating going forwards, as to whether that's something that we can innovate around to help people better connect to our coast and sea. So I'll actually just drop my work email in the chat, actually, for anyone that's interested in connecting on that later on. But yeah, happy to take that offline more so another time. Thanks, Dave.
Thank you, Ffion. That's really good, and connecting those two things is great. Keep the questions coming, please, in the Q&A. I can see them coming through, and I'll try and address as many as I can as we go along. I wanted to come to a few of you now around, we talked about why it's important. We talked about its importance in being inclusive. We talked about your definitions. Now I just want to touch on really some of the specifics around barriers for the ocean sector. So you mentioned, Celine, some of the work you've done terrestrially. You talked about communities. Is some of what we talked about, some of the barriers, I should say, some of the barriers to inclusivity, are they specific to the ocean sector, or are they specific to society? I'm just really interested in that. And again, the example we were talking with Caitlin around universities, marine science rather than university, not particularly diverse. Why is that compared to some other course or some other profession? So I guess from your experience, Celine, is any of this ocean specific, or perhaps what is ocean specific around this lack of diversity, or what are the barriers?
This is an excellent question, and well, I think it's an issue that is not just about the ocean. Okay, so it's a wide worldwide issue, and that encompasses many different sectors. Now, when it comes to the marine environment, there's something a bit different here, just due to the nature of the space and and all the framing around what is the ocean. Is it a place for us? It's wet, cold, dark, deep, dangerous. So all these narratives, the way that ocean have been constructed so far, that is very much one vision of the ocean that does not correspond to the vision of many communities that have a very, very different experience and relations to the ocean. So there may be something specific with that, but there are also issues around access, and I think this is really crucial. And the term access has been mentioned already several times here. How do we access blue space? How different groups access blue space? And just to give an example, the coast is less than 5 miles from Lancaster. Many kids here don't use this space. They don't go there. I discussed with schools who said they don't have the funding to take the children there. So there are some obstacles, some economic obstacles, some cultural obstacles as well. There was a very interesting report published last year by the Scottish government about inequalities in access to blue spaces. And they were talking about the different obstacles, that why don't people access blue spaces? And of course, there are questions of, it could be physical barriers. Is it accessible enough? The question of cost as well. It could be the personal motivation, but also there are also highlighted social factors. Some groups don't feel like they would fit in this place. They feel it's not made for them. When they picture who are the type of people walking along the coast, they picture a white family walking a dog, and that's not who they are. It does not fit with them, and they don't feel that it's a place where they would be welcome. So the wide range of economic and cultural barrier obstacles that we need to overcome. And through my work here with young people, it is really, really apparent that although we're not talking about people living in the center of Birmingham, but we're living very, very close to a coastal area, but not using that space, because they don't feel it's for them. They don't feel there's anything to do for them, because planning has not taken their need into consideration. So there's no activity, nothing they think of doing there. And of course, the question of finance and costing as well, of just the access transportation issue. So the wide range of issues, but I very much think that there's a cultural element here as well, how the coast is being represented, who it is for, what type of pictures people have in mind when they think about the coast and the ocean.
Thanks, Celine. Yeah, it's very interesting that, because I think you said at the beginning there's a societal issue, not just ocean. But actually, everything you said it makes it very clear that there is something different there, isn't it, about the ocean, the way it looks, the way it's kind of advertised. I always remember when I was young, if you saw a marine biology degree, for example, advertised, it'd be a young white woman in a scuba equipment, over a coral reef. It didn't show a muddy flat in South Wales sort of thing, So it's kind of interesting, and I don't take much notice anymore of marine biology courses, but I don't know if that's changed. But it's kind of like, if you saw some imagery that didn't talk to you as a person and say, well, that's not me, so do I fit there? Do I belong there, sort of thing? So I think that's really, really interesting. I just want to come to you, Yvette, as well. The same question, really. Do you, in your experience with surfacing in sewage and with your surfing work, do you find there's something specific about the ocean or the coast that is a barrier?
Yes, definitely. Very easy answer. Yeah, there's really specific barriers when we're talking about ocean advocacy, activism and conservation. We're currently in the process of we're testing a toolkit around equity, diversity and inclusion. We've actually made a really specific wheel of privilege, which is specifically for ocean activists. And that does include things like that. I'm looking over here because it's actually on my other screen, is like your cultural connection to water, the climate impact, the access to healthy and safe blue spaces. Again, with the sort of proviso around blue spaces, because I'm growing increasingly uncomfortable with the term, because it's become almost stolen and made into some kind of elite activity to go and have blue health in a blue space and all that stuff. And the reality is we live surrounded by water that is predominantly brown. It's not usually blue. If you're really lucky, you live somewhere where there's blue water, but yeah, in the UK, that's not usually the case. So we are creating that specifically around ocean access so that people can see that there are really, really specific barriers. It's not just this one size fits all in terms of environmentalism. I think access to water and water advocacy are really different and often very separate to nature, and we don't see them as connected, although they are. We don't tend to be presented with water as being part of that nature discussion. So we definitely see that actually advocacy around water is a very, very different space to environmental discussions, for example.
Thank you. That's really clear. Thanks, Yvette. Caitlin, do you want to come in?
Yeah, it's just to kind of come back on the same question again, and this is kind of coming from a personal space as well, from being a young carer, but I think there are certainly barriers very specific to the ocean sector. Obviously, I've seen that as I've grown up through studying, through work, but kind of speaking as well that we might not necessarily recognise it sometimes from where we all sit with working in this or advocating for it or just being involved in it, but it can actually be somewhat of a privilege to be able to care about the environment in the ocean. A lot of people, their day-to-day is worrying about how they're going to make ends meet and whether they're able to actually genuinely access any spaces. So with my mum being disabled, we basically have to do in-depth studies of where we're going to do and where we're going to go and what we're going to do and whether they're going to have space for her wheelchair and whether she can move X, Y, Z. And she lives most of her days in a lot of pain as well. So that's essentially what her focus is. She doesn't have much extra space to consider anything else. And that's true for quite a lot of people that are either similar to her and struggling with economic circumstances or other personal circumstances that they just don't have the capacity to necessarily be active within the sort of environmental space. So I think that needs to be, as much as it might seem somewhat disconnected when you consider it, it does have to be considered as the wider picture to actually address these sort of problems that communities are having outside of specific environmental and ocean spaces, because only by doing that can they then have capacity to actually include themselves within conversations as well and to be included within them and have the capacity to actually care about obviously more than what their personal struggles are. So that's just kind of like a personal 2 cents on that. And then I think as well, environmental speaking, and then obviously specific to the ocean field, a lot of the language that we use is very inaccessible. And I know we can't help that because there's a lot of really long terms sometimes that the quickest way to say it is in some really short acronym. But if we're only communicating in acronyms and really complex policy speak, then of course people aren't necessarily going to involve themselves. Sometimes I went to a High Seas Treaty Symposium, and as interested as I was to learn more, there were so many acronyms being thrown about, and this was someone that's already very involved in the ocean space, and I had no idea what anyone was talking about to be able to include myself in conversations or to contribute. So I think we need to consider as well how we can make our own language and discussion more accessible for people to be involved and for them to spread messages themselves, rather than essentially shutting the doors immediately by using this really complex terminology that, yeah, fine, we can get it amongst ourselves sometimes, depending what it is, because we don't know everything about everything. But yeah, to basically ensure that it's discussed in a way that people can be brought alongside with us and be advocates themselves, whatever capacity they have to be so.
Thank you, Caitlin. It's like we practiced this and we didn't, because I've now got a poll I'd like to ask everybody around language, and I think it'd be really interesting to see what people think, really. You know, we talk about ocean justice, we have today, it can mean a myriad of different things to different people. Some people talk about gender diversity, neurodiversity, ethnic diversity, youth voice. Others talk about just transitions in fisheries. Internationally, we talk about women's access to aquaculture, for example. So lots of fuzziness there, really, on what we mean. So I'm just going to ask our audience, just another quick poll while you're there, really, is when you hear ocean justice, what is the first word that comes to your mind? So I'll just give you a minute to put that in, and we'll see what that says. And then for our panelists, just to consider a question which falls nicely following what Caitlin has just said. So, is language important? Is an important part of access and inclusion? You know, we're going to see a poll now with lots of these different words, what people say, what they think. Often it comes up around, you know, for example, invasive species, as well as often a terminology. So I guess the question is, and I won't ask you, Caitlin, because you've answered it already, is language important? Is language important as a part of access and inclusion? And I might come to you first, Ffion.
Yeah. It's the short answer to that, isn't it? I feel like we're gonna be getting a lot of yeses in this group. Yeah, I mean, language is absolutely critical. It's often and can be the first barrier that a lot of people face when it comes to even deciding or contemplating whether they want the ocean coastal space to become part of their identity, or if they decide they might want to interact with it anyway. So yeah, language alongside, visual representation is absolutely critical. I think obviously Caitlin's really already touched on the issue around technical terminology. This, I would say that this isn't something that we perhaps suffer with alone as an ocean and coastal sector. There are lots of sectors that find it very difficult to remind themselves around the challenges of using specialist and technical terminology. Also within, I guess, specific industries within the coast and sea sector. So, for example, I was doing some work with a port recently that had been developing a recruitment pathway, and the job description referred to seamen. So see men as being people that they would want to apply for that particular role. And, it took a while for people to perhaps reflect on the fact that actually maybe that isn't very appealing or attractive to anyone that isn't going to identify as a man. So, but historically, that has been the terminology associated with that particular role within that particular sector. So I think what becomes increasingly challenging as well around terminology and language is who gets to define the words in which how we want to identify and define ourselves. Because that then also becomes a conversation around who holds the power and how are we relinquishing and distributing that power, right? So who are we to say, if you want to identify as a seaman, then you actually can't do that anymore because that's not inclusive language. Who are we to have that conversation? But maybe we are to have that conversation, right? But just really also thinking about it from the other perspective as well, and that connection historically and culturally when it comes to heritage with some of these terminologies. So it's a very, very loaded space to begin to operate in and start having those conversations. But I think having those conversations are absolutely critical, nonetheless, if we are wanting to diversify. So that's just kind of one piece around English terminology. I guess the other side to this coin, guys, is we don't just speak English, right? Let's think about language way more broadly here in the UK. So you all heard me introduce myself in Welsh when I joined this webinar, made my introduction. Welsh is my first language. I'm really, really proud to be a first language Welsh speaker, and we are a marginalised minority group when it comes to language in the UK, as are the other Celtic native languages that we have in the UK, as well as over 300, 500 other languages that we speak in the UK. In England for alone, as an example, I think it's about over 20% of primary school students in England have English as a second language. So just also really challenging ourselves around, why are we so dead set in only producing everything in English? Because even though we might say we aren't, we kind of really are. So I think just really challenging ourselves around that and reminding ourselves of the incredible and rich kind of linguistic diversity that we have in the UK.
Thanks, Ffion. That's a really interesting point, isn't it, about language as a fellow Welsh person. I don't speak Welsh as a first language, and it's that diversity in one corner of the UK as one part of Europe is really interesting, the kind of diversity you get there. Thank you for that. Alan, I'm going to come to you for a couple of questions, really. And again, linking, I suppose, back to your previous role and now, and the second question will come into your current role, really. And there's a question in the Q&A from Heidi, and it says, I'll read part of it. It says, given that the UK environmental policy traditionally relies on a narrow interpretation of evidence, often limited to conventional ecological and economic metrics, how can we ensure a meaningful inclusion of diverse stakeholders in the decision-making process? So I guess my question to you really is that in your experience, in your previous role in Scotland, how do you get that meaningful inclusion from stakeholders around decision-making?
It's a really good question. I'll pick up on the evidence point first of all, because I think that's really interesting. Some of the work that I did with the Coastal Communities Network ties into that. So, yes, the government, we quite rightly do make evidence-based policy decisions, but there is a big question mark about what is considered, appropriate evidence of a certain quality And I've been involved working with lots of citizen science coastal groups in Scotland who are collecting a wealth of information, whether it is mapping seagrass beds or engaging in cetacean watching programs, whatever it might be. And one of the difficulties that these groups have had is, having that sort of that evidence. I mean, one, first of all, is the actually being able to physically have it input in a way that can then feed into policy and decision making. I mean, I don't know how in Scotland specifically, the systems for that process to happen are just not there yet. Basically, it's quite cumbersome, and you have to have quite a high level of technical expertise to be able to like input the data into the format that's actually needed. And I've forgotten what my second point was going to be. Could you repeat the question, please? And that might prompt me to reflect.
Yeah, I think you kind of, there's two parts really. It's around evidence, and the other one was around how do you ensure the meaningful inclusion around decision making, really, making sure that stakeholders aren't just, I suppose, reading into the question, paraphrasing a bit. It's kind of like, well, you ask people, but you actually involve them in the decision making.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. I've got a lot I can say on this, but I'll try and keep it quite brief. So, it comes to that sort of that big question that you sort of outlined at the beginning, of power and how we transfer power to young people, to coastal communities. I think there's two sort of parts to that. I feel there's sort of institutional structures, and there's sort of a commitment from whether it's, an NGO, a public sector body, government, to sharing authority and resources. Just to kind of give examples of where, how I think that that issue particularly could be addressed. For young people, for example, I encourage organizations and, public sector, third sector, whatever, to look at their institutional structures and see if they can, is there a way we can institutionalize inclusion and participation from these groups? And it might be things like youth councils, advisory boards, committees, whatever you might want to call it, but having a structure in which you can get sort of, and a structure that has genuine influence on those sort of that policies or those projects or whatever it might be. I think that goes a long way to ensuring, sort of supported, consistent participation and inclusion. Many cases that, lots of the community groups that I work with in Scotland, they would love to be more around the table. So are there organizations that already exist that you could be collaborating with, particularly around if we're thinking of MPAs or any sort of practical conservation initiatives? Can you be partnering and letting the communities themselves lead, or at least have some sort of authority and veto over decisions that impact them? I guess the fundamental point is that, which kind of model you adopt, it should be more than just consultative. We need to actually, I think there needs to be a culture change, at least in Scotland, and I assume it's the same in England and Wales, elsewhere in the UK, is there's a reluctance to hand over power and decision-making authority to community groups, to young people. And I often see this sort of participation as very tokenistic. We consult young people, but we might do what you suggest, but we might not. But I think we really need to sort of give genuine power and authority to these groups. And I also just want to follow up very quickly. I like to say this: with power must come resources as well. It's all good and well setting up these structures or partnering with community-based organizations and telling them, like, okay, you lead this, but what are the appropriate resources? And that could be financial resources, access to data, training and skills development. Like, you're not going to get sort of genuine participation, meaningful participation. I hope that wasn't too waffly and answered the question.
Not at all, Alan, not at all. And it's really kind of triggered something in my head, really thinking about it. And I guess the question to others is a really good segue. How can you transfer power to young people or to communities in the decision making? Now, I know you've all, like, Celine, you've done research with young people on the coast with your photographs you mentioned. Caitlin, obviously, university, and Yvette and Ffion, you've all worked with young people. And this is kind of, I suppose, the second part of what we wanted to talk about today, really talking about young people and their involvement. So I'll come to each of you. Now Alan's had said something to say about young people, really is, how do we transfer that power to young people in decision making? I'll start with you, Celine.
Yeah, thanks. I would say we're very much not there yet. We're very much not about transferring power. I think we're just at the stage of just first valuing them, making sure they are being valued and recognized as very important partners, not just a group to get some information about at some point, but as true partner. This is the first challenge. And I would say there's also a question, we talked about language before, but also language around who are these young people. We're not talking about homogeneous group. The reality I'm seeing here may be very different from the southwest of England, for example. So what young people are we talking about? In what social and economic realities? What challenges are they going through? Talking about barriers as we did before. So first, defining who are the young people we need to engage with in a given context. And then there's difficulty about how do we reach them first. First, you need to have the willingness to reach them. And that's maybe the most difficult thing. How do we get decision makers to be willing to understand the need to work with them? And then how do we reach them? And this is also a challenge I've had in my research, that when you do research and you try to recruit young people and you have a call for participation, you're going to reach a certain type of young people who may already be interested in the topic. And it's very difficult to reach the one who have not been heard so far, feel they don't have a voice and they don't matter. So it's really, really difficult. So you need to work through schools, but it's not always the right, the most efficient way. Community centers and small organizations who already work with young people, I found that very, very helpful. So first question is, how do we reach the young people who have been left apart so far? So that's really the first step before then thinking about transferring power. But then it's about finding ways of engaging with them, finding ways that they will find an interest in. So I've been using photography, but other creative methods can be used. It could be other form of art, music. So it's once again, it's about getting to know and not putting young people into one category, but getting to know who we're working with and what is really going to generate interest from them and how they're going to feel valued, how to make them feel valued. So that's the very, very first step. And then, so the discussion I had with the young people here, when I asked them, what do you think decision maker could do? How do you think the council should work with you? And they're talking about a wide range of different examples, from visiting community centers to organizing activities along the coast where they would invite young people. So they were thinking, they're very, very creative. We were talking about innovation before. They did produce a lot of different ideas as to how they would like to work with a council. But I think that the message I'm trying to give here is really, there's not one single answer to that question. It's really about the realities of different locations, different social economic realities, very different dynamics. So I don't think that one size fits all type of solution, magical solution would work. It's really about, and that's why the work done by a local organization is so important. Really so important, because they know the communities are working with. So for me, it's really about local solutions.
Right, thank you, Celine. I'm just going to ask Caitlin the same question really about how you transfer that power to young people.
Yeah, so I'm 24, so I kind of fall into the young person category or just before, depending who it is that you look to for your definition of a young person. And I think a lot of it does come down to, obviously, we discussed language before being a barrier. That is still a massive barrier as well to young people. I think someone had mentioned in the Q&A as well that it's not even necessarily the technical jargon, but our everyday language that we use as well. Using too many sort of sophisticated words and language like that can, again, turn people off a bit and be a barrier to access as well. But I think an important part of it is that it isn't just tokenistic. It's not just, I'm going to host this event and come and take a photo with all the young people and post it on my social media to get some kind of points and be like, I'm down with the kids, and then move on, and that's that. It's about either hosting events in the communities where young people are, especially young people in coastal communities and things, and actually having them be accessible to them in a way that it's understanding what the local issues are. So it's basically an onus is on the decision makers or whoever, if it's a politician that's coming out, the onus is on them to do their research to understand the communities that they're going to visit and their unique requirements. It would also ideally be utilising the resource they have at hand. For example, bringing a young person in to help them design an event to engage with other young people, because obviously nobody knows young people better than young people do, and how it is that they best sort of respond to information and where it is that they get their information from, and the sort of barriers that they're facing locally and obviously globally as well. And as well as that, having ongoing communication with it. So if young people are going to be at an event, or if it's an event run specifically for young people, continue to remain in touch with them and be transparent about the steps that are being taken with young people's involvement from that event. So for example, if they've gone with the idea of proposing, for example, the National Marine Plan that's happening in Scotland, there was youth advocacy events arranged around that, specifically for young people to attend online. But rather than just having those events and then walking away and leaving it, actually have an ongoing form of communication with them to say, we've taken on board this feedback that you provided in this session, this is the next step, this is another opportunity for you to engage along the line, here's the details. And that way they don't just feel abandoned, like they've given their insight and whether or not it will be used or forgotten about. Or again, like it was just purely tokenistic to tick a box and say, we've done the young people engagement part. Let's move on to the adults and take in what they've got to say and actually utilise what they want. So that ongoing engagement and kind of involving young people in the processes, both leading up to and moving on from, I think is really critical to ensuring that young people, one, want to be engaged and actually come and seek it out. And two, that they actually feel like they're valued and that they do have some degree of power within decision making that then comes from that. Because really, if you do organise the events for young people that show an understanding of it and that are very evidently not tokenistic and are actually going to provide some degree of value and take insights on board, the young people will come. Like, they want to be in these spaces and they want to say whatever it is that they want to say. And they want their voices to be heard and valued, and they will come to you if you organise that. So yeah, I think as well, specifically reaching out to people and youth groups and things as well to say, we're having this event, we'd like your young people to come, rather than just kind of posting on social media and hoping for the best. Because socials are now just crammed with all sorts of nonsense quite a lot of the time, that it just doesn't break through, and that's just not the way to go about it. You need to do targeted engagement as well to ensure that voices are being heard and they are getting the message, and that they can actually engage with whatever is being planned. So yeah, I think that's someone of my opinion as a very frustrated young person that's wanted to be involved in these processes for so long, and is, not to toot our own horn, but is grateful to organisations like Young Sea Changers Scotland for actually recognising those barriers, breaking them down and providing those opportunities and connections for young people to engage.
Right, thanks, Caitlin. Yeah, I'm going to bring you in now, and I was going to ask you actually, what does good youth engagement look like, really? But make your point as well on the back of what Caitlin was saying.
Sorry, I left myself on mute. Yeah, it was really just to we were talking about the transfer of power, and just I want to give a really practical example of what we as Young Sea Changers Scotland do. We have 3 young people on our board of trustees, for example. And that's something that we've actually built into our constitution, so that's as we've committed as an organisation to having young people in the driving seat of our organisation and making those strategic decisions. Obviously, if you're going to involve young people in your board of trustees, that will require a certain level of support for those young people to be able to kind of understand and get the most out of that opportunity. But I would just challenge organisations on this call today, how many of you have young people on your board of trustees or your project boards or whatever it might be? I think that's a very tangible way of empowering young people and sort of walking the talk, as it were, when we think about transferring power and authority to those groups. Yeah. And so that follow-up question, what does good youth engagement look like? I would say it really depends. I mean, a lot of it has been covered already by Celine, and I absolutely agree that we shouldn't look at youth as a sort of homogenous social grouping. There are lots of young people from lots of different backgrounds, and each of these groups face different barriers and challenges for engaging in projects and policies, etc. And therefore, that means that the participatory approaches that we use to engage young people have to be diverse as the communities that we're engaging. Just as a very, very simple, tangible example, we run a marine advocacy training program for young people, and one of the things we noticed is a drop-off in participation around the end of April and May, and the reason for that is because a lot of young people are at school and universities, and that's exam season, you know. So if you're arranging your participatory processes for around then, you're going to lose a lot of engagement from school age children, university students, etc. So just very simple things like that to take into mind when you're designing your engagement process. I'd also say, you know, it really depends on the objective as well. Like, you know, we were talking about transferring power, and, you know, obviously I advocate for, you know, the empowerment of young people, but that can take many different shapes, and it's a whole spectrum of, you know, the sort of level of power and responsibility we want to give to certain groups for certain processes. So I just want to, yeah, I think the point I'm trying to make there is we have to be clear on the objective of what that participation is for. It might be that we do just want to understand young people's views on something rather than, you know, having them lead on something, for example. So I think, yeah, being clear and upfront and honest about that with the groups that you're engaging is super fundamental. It's already been said, but I don't think good engagement is a one-off event, and that's why I advocate for like institutionalizing participation through groups and forums and committees, etc., ensuring that, you know, there's long-term involvement and there's follow-up on the ideas and the views that are put forward, and fundamentally that all of that is supported. You know, young people face financial and financial barriers around time. So I think when you're going for funding for projects or design engagement processes, that you're factoring in travel expenses, for example, to attend physical engagement events, recognizing that not all young people actually have access to good internet. Thinking of like rural island communities here, you know, during the winter, Wi-Fi connections can be very dodgy. So just lots of very small practical things that can really make a difference when you're thinking about engagement. And the final point is, and also I think it's also very important, is just acknowledging and celebrating their contributions as well. It's a lot to ask of young people when we're, you know, engaging them in, for example, the example Caitlin gave of the National Marine Plan online events. You know, young people are giving up their time to come and participate and share views, and that has to be celebrated and acknowledged, so that then, yeah, generates a good feeling about being part of that space and makes them want to continue to be involved.
Yeah, it's a great point. It's a great point, Alan. Thank you for that. We've got time for one more question, which I'm going to go around all of you. And the question is really, and we've talked a lot about definitions today, talked a lot about good practice, we've talked a lot about what's wrong. You can guess where I'm going with this really. It's kind of, you know, where should we be focusing our energy to create real systemic change in access and inclusion in the ocean sector? And I come to all of you, but before I do that, we're going to have a poll at the end. As I mentioned right at the very beginning, we're going to be holding these Ocean Justice series of webinars quarterly for the next couple of years, and looking for different topics and different speakers and different ideas really. So there'll be a poll along soon. I just want to kind of draw out something that was in the Q&A. Not so much of a question, but I'll just read kind of part of it out. It's talking about offshore wind, and it says, it's very profound to me that the success of the energy transition rests on our ability to build better democracies locally, where more powerful players are equal to citizens, and design redistributive models that are less capitalistic. Really interesting question there. We're not going to have time to tackle all of that now, but I think that could be something really for the future around the energy transition, but also around you know, the balance and equality of power in all of that. So I just wanted to flag that, and just there's going to be a poll coming in the next couple of minutes. But anyway, going back to you, the question for each of you really, you know, what should we be focusing our energy on to get that real systemic change? If we can just do that in just 2 minutes each, that would be wonderful. And I'll start with you, Yvette, if that's okay.
Yeah, no worries. I was thinking, yeah, it's very similar to the question in the chat about how do we make the sector more inclusive? What are the priorities for actual action? I think for me, one of the biggest things, and it is the most, it's not the most exciting or glamorous of things, but is data. You're not going to know if you've made any improvements unless you have a starting point. So that was one of the things we set in place within Surfers Against Sewage as soon as I joined the organisation, was staff surveys, internal surveys, completely anonymous, to find out demographics within the current workforce from all levels of staff and trustees, to basically see where we are. And then you can basically have a comparison. So I think having a baseline across the area you work in is really, really important, because if you're trying to make outward change, you need to be able to evidence that outward change. You need to be able to say, right, this year we you know, we've worked within this particular community, and, you know, maybe that person has been retained as a member of staff, or maybe you've run an internship like we've done, and maybe one of those interns is now doing regular paid writing for us. So being able to evidence that is really critical. And the only way you can do that is if you start on a baseline. And, you know, and I think you probably all know when you look at your own sectors, is it's probably not going to be the most thrilling of baselines to have, and it is just going to reflect what you think. But having it there nonetheless is probably the most important bit of information you can have about your current workforce and your current audience, if you can then structure that out into who you're engaging with, because then you actually have evidence to say, right, here's where we need to. You can then, you know, like Caitlin said, you can then do targeted outreach work. But I think where the sector is kind of straying away from that is actually it's quite dull, it's quite boring, it's quite arduous. You're asking people to share information, albeit anonymous, but it's often easier and more glamorous to do those really horrendous extractive moments of, let's put on an item or an event, helicopter in, throw some money at it, get some posts, and then boom, you think you've done your job. But that is really quickly seen through as being tokenistic and being extractive. So unless you've got something behind all of those beautiful socials and visuals, that's going to get called out pretty quickly. So I think ensuring that you're getting your own house in order should be everyone's priority, and then look at that outward work. That's my advice.
Thanks for that. It's great, because, you know, without that baseline, how do we know if change is happening? But also, you know, as you say, it's a way to engage people as well at the same time, isn't it? Caitlin, come to you.
Yes, totally agree with what Yvette said. I think my other point as well is to approach things from the bottom up. So this, whether it applies to the actual practical application of conservation in the form of protected areas or anything, or rewilding, or whether it is from a sort of more government standpoint or systemic view, we need to take more of that bottom-up approach, because that is really the approach that takes into consideration the communities which found the decisions that we make and that will be affected by the decisions that we either make or we don't make. And it ties into that, obviously, as we've been discussing all the way through diversity and inclusion and student intersectionality. We need to recognise what community needs are and how they're also quite unique in different demographic areas as well, and geographic areas. Using that to influence the decisions that we make and the conservation actions that we take, whether we're an NGO or whether we are government. And yeah, just filtering it through from that very baseline level, understanding who we're working with, what they need, where it is that we're going to be working, and using that to inform everything that we do. Because at the end of the day, as I said before, there are people that are disproportionately affected by the climate and nature crises, and unless that is recognised and utilised on the way through, then we're all going to serve to fail in the long term. So this is a future that we're all going to inherit, and we've all got the decision to see what that future outlook's going to be. But we have to ensure that everybody's got a seat at the table and recognise what seats are empty and who's missing, and ensure that they are reached out to and brought along. So yeah, I think that's a key thing for me, is to ensure that bottom up, and also a degree of co-management as well. That, yeah, great, the government can be there to provide the sort of legislative overview and the policy documents and the rest of it, but don't just sort of designate and shove on communities and expect them to deal with it. You actually have to have a greater understanding of what community needs are to inform your policy and your conservation, and all the efforts that all of us take as conservationists and environmentalists, or whatever it is that you identify yourself as in this space.
Great, thank you, Caitlin. Over to you, Celine.
Yeah, thanks. I also, very agree with Caitlin. I also wanted to talk about the need for approach from below, really, and because when it comes to systemic change, I think an issue that there are some very big structures of knowledge that are dominant and are influence the way we perceive different social phenomenon, and development and sustainable development is one of them, and also the way we see development has evolved and it's supposed to be sustainable. We know that it will always be the economic dimension that is going to prevail, and that is going to take precedence over all the rest. So that also links to the comment that would just been made in the chat about maybe a model a bit less capitalistic. So, I mean, this is a huge topic in itself that I'm not going to cover there, but I think it's very difficult to think in terms of systemic change without completely rethinking the economic model that is at the root of many environmental issues we're facing at the moment. And that also is an explanation of why sustainable development is still not very much sustainable, because it seems that if we're considering sustainable development as three circles between the economy, the environment, and society, the economy is a much bigger circle than the other. So there's no real place for true conservation, efficient conservation, and to the inclusion of people. So that's why systemic change is so difficult, because we have to completely rethink our knowledge, structures of knowledge, and big narrative, big discourses around what is to be developed, what is development, and so on. So that's why I really believe in bottom-up approaches. That's really where the change can happen. So that's really where the efforts need to put, and time. Effort is time, it's money as well, funding. That's really where we should, the priority should be going. But also, it will be my second point, I also think it's about valuing a different type of science. We talked about language before, and when people think about ocean, people think about science, STEM, science, technology. If we really want to be more inclusive, we also need to value a bit more social sciences. And for a long time, social sciences were not really considered in discussion about the ocean. It has changed, so that's the positive method. It has changed. There has been an increase in social sciences works on the ocean. So it is changing, but it needs to be taken in consideration by decision makers as well, by project managers, people implementing projects. They need to take into consideration to involve social scientists as well, because there are the people who work with communities as well. We hold the data as well that Yvette was talking about before. So we need to value a bit more social science and to recognize the value of social science and the role it can play in sustainable and fair and just ocean management.
Yeah, thank you, Celine. That's a really good point at the end there. Alan, just very quickly, and then I'll come to you, Ffion.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I mean, a lot of good stuff has already been said, and I mean, I guess the point is it's very multifaceted. Lots of different things that we can do to create that systemic change. So completely agree with this bottom-up co-managed approach that Caitlin and Celine have been talking about. But I'll maybe take a different slant then, just to add something extra to the conversation, because I think if I sort of reflect on systemic change within our own organizations and representation within our organizations, what can we do as a sector? Two things come to mind there. One is we sort of talked about access to blue spaces, to the sea, to the coast. I think that sort of early exposure to the marine and coastal environment, and also to ocean science and the sector, I think that's absolutely fundamental. And I think there's a lot of work that we can do as a sector to expose young audiences to what it means to work in the sector. What is the ocean sector? All the different jobs that are available, all the different career paths. And that's my second point then is, and it just sort of harks back to what Caitlin was talking about on the inaccessibility of education, because I don't see a lot of entry-level jobs in this sector, and I think we should be looking at alternative career pathways into the sector. So thinking about whether it's apprenticeships, internships, certifications that don't require you to have a formalized academic degree that automatically shuts the door on so many marginalized communities. So if we really want to diversify our own workforce, our own volunteers, I think looking at what are other ways that people can enter into our organization that don't require them to have that sort of academic sort of background, or have years of experience of volunteering, and that just isn't possible for a lot of young people, but also like lots of others in disadvantaged backgrounds. So yeah, that's my 2 cents on that, I think.
Perfect. It's great, Alan. Thank you. And finally to you, Ffion.
Okay, I'm going to be short and snappy because I've also just seen that the poll has gone up. So I guess my step one, thinking about systemic change, that all starts with individuals, right? So that starts with you as a singular person. So my first step would be have a long, hard look in the mirror and really reflect on and accept your own privilege. That's really, really important. And then just make a start. And that can be so many different things, and it will be different for all of you from person to person. So for me, thinking about my personal journey around supporting equity, diversity and inclusion and being a champion for that work, it took me so long to start. I'm going to put my hands up and say that. It took me a really, really, really long time to start, because for me, I care about people so much. I'm sure we all do. And I really wanted to get it right straight out the gate. And that was my first error, was being held back by my own fear of getting things wrong. It's inevitable. You know, this is going to be and is very new for us as a sector. We already know that because we are in the position that we're in. So just be ready to welcome in and face that discomfort and take that as a learning opportunity, even if it might feel like failure in the first instance. It's not, it's growth. So just really welcome that in and just stay resilient and remind yourself that just making a start and keeping on going is really important. I'll just leave it there.
Wonderful, great way to finish. Thank you, Ffion, for that. So just to bring it all together, really, we've covered language today, we've covered access, covered transferring power, talked about young people, and then at the end there, how to create change. And we really want to build on some of this in future events, future research and future discussions with all of you on this call to help catalyse that change, really. So just remains for me to say thank you so much to our brilliant panel, to Yvette, to Alan, to Ffion, Caitlin and Celine. This recording will be put up on the Ocean and Coastal Futures YouTube channel soon. So thank you all very much for coming. Thank you all for watching, and goodbye.